Recording from our respective locations, I'm Public Affairs Director Matthew Huffman, and this is Momentum, a webcast produced by your coalition connecting advocates across our state. So this month, I am joined by two members of our prevention team who have been guests on Momentum before. So welcome back, Megan and Sam.
Hi.
It is September, and September is both Campus Safety Awareness Month and also the start of the fall semester through Thanksgiving is what is considered to be the red zone on college campuses. And that's a time that's really described as a period of time on campuses whenever there is an uptick in reported campus sexual assault. So I felt like it would be a really good time for us to really dig into this conversation a little more as our prevention team, and for a few reasons. A year ago in September, we had on friend of the webcast, Haley Harold, previous staff member at MOCADSV, now runs Safe Bar Network, to really kind of talk about how we do bar outreach and how we use that as a prevention strategy for drug-facilitated sexual assault that we know often happens in college campus communities. But as I was thinking about how to talk this year about campus sexual violence, I had a reminder recently of some of the really antiquated messages that we send to college students. So I have a good friend who works on a college campus as an advisor. There was recently a sexual assault that happened on campus, and campus law enforcement sent an email out to all students and staff saying, we're working with local law enforcement. We've been made aware that there have been some drug facilitated sexual assaults or sexual assault attempts, and we wanted to help students understand how to prevent that. But when I read the email, it wasn't prevention. It was those risk reduction tactics that we've all heard for a really long time. Don't accept a drink from a stranger. Don't put your drink down unattended. Use the buddy system. And as my friend and I were talking about this email that went out, she said, I read that and I felt like I was back in the early 2000s watching an episode of Veronica Mars. And so it really just made me think about, not in a good way. You're right, Sam. Not in a good way of remembering Veronica Mars. But it really got me thinking, let's have a conversation and flip the script on campus sexual violence and some of these more dominant narratives that we hear come up in conversation year after year. So I kind of just wanted to open it up from there and see, from your perspectives, what are things that you're hearing right now about campus sexual violence, and how has this narrative not really changed so much?
I feel like you're absolutely right, Matthew, that it's exact same messages. Like I remember hearing those things when I was in college, and it kind of feels like the exact same strategies have been offered for a very long time. We're not seeing any sort of actual reduction in the rates of violence on campuses. And so this really specific narrative about how to avoid the kind of stranger danger type of sexual assault really doesn't talk about the realities or, address the realities that most people's experience of sexual assault is from someone that they know and have some sort of relationship with. And so when our strategies are so focused on this kind of stranger danger element, we really don't address a lot of what many students are experiencing and the kinds of prevention strategies that are necessary to address that kind of assault from someone that you know and have a relationship with.
To be honest, we'll do absolutely anything to ever be able to avoid talking about sex, like as a general thing, like including rape prevention, like everything that you're even given as like a strategy to prevent it does everything to like as gloss over the sexual component as possible. And it's still like, sex education is still so deeply problematic and inconsistency throughout the country that it's really not surprising that we haven't gotten any better at talking about how to prevent rape. Because if we're not even comfortable talking about consensual sex, we're not going to be able to get anywhere near talking about sex that is not sex because it's rape, you know, like that's something that's very deeply confusing for people, even though it's really not at all, because people don't understand consent, which is one of those things that it's so easy that people make really difficult. And so I feel like it's just one of those things that it's like, of course we haven't gotten any better. We're still afraid to talk about sex at all, let alone like the complicated parts of sex that come along when you know the person who is violating your boundaries.
Yeah, Sam, I think that that's such a really, really important aspect of this. We are doing young people a disservice by not giving comprehensive and inclusive sex education to them before they even get to a college campus. We can't assume that college students have had access to that. And then they show up on a college campus and they have a newfound freedom. They have access to drugs and alcohol. They are exploring their identity and their sexualities in ways that they haven't been able to before. But also they don't have the skills to navigate those conversations about sexual boundaries and sexual desires. So I completely agree with you that that's such a really important part of this conversation that and Megan and I were talking about this earlier, you know, that we've created an environment where we are now doing a disservice to all college students because we haven't set them up with the skills they need to go into that new environment.
And it's not even just that we've doing them a disservice, like, as you said, like their skills, like this is just an abject failure on our part because we think if we don't give you information, then that means that like, you're just not going to have it. But all the research shows, and as we see in our work all the time, just because somebody doesn't give me good information doesn't mean I don't have any information, which means the information that I'm then getting is most likely very at best poorly informed, and like at worst is someone setting me up to victimize me because they're able to then pour whatever they want in. And I don't have anything to combat that, especially if it feels like this is a topic that nobody else is telling me about, because then you feel like the one person who's giving me that story, that honesty, that truth that no one else will talk about, which means I'm going to put way more weight on that information you're giving me, no matter what the true tone or intent of it is. And it's just, especially like for how formative those years are and how unsure you are of anything, anybody who seems sure of anything is going to be someone that you just at that time in your life are going to flock to.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, Sammy, of just talking about comprehensive sex education kind of right away, because there was a webinar I was just in where they were talking about that as a prevention strategy and just how important it is for understanding students' experiences when we understand the, you know, I guess how sexual education is in our country right now. And with so many states who are, for example, not required to teach medically accurate information. A lot of the students are coming from areas with lack of resources, really inaccurate sex education, there's a huge gap in any information at all about LGBTQ sex ed. And in many states, it's mandatory for them to teach homophobic sex education. And so there's all these students who are coming in having no understanding, no experiences in sex education that sets them up for success and regarding their sexual relationships. And there's a quote from a book that we're going to talk about later, Sexual Citizens, but I feel like it really fit in with this part of the conversation. So I wanted to go ahead and read that. And it's from one of the students in the case studies. And they said, what does it mean to be so unsure of one's sexual boundaries? So without a language for physical and sexual autonomy, that you need a workshop on consent to understand that you've been violated. And so many of the students in this book were talking about how they had no understanding of their experiences. And then when they finally got some sort of course that talked about consent or like healthy sex, they realized that they had experienced sexual assault and just how devastating that is for students to not get that information and then have basically be slapped in the face by the fact that they experienced something horrific and really not have the language for what to do and how to move forward from that.
Absolutely. Like whenever I think of this, like this is not going back to college, is going back to high school, but like whenever I think about sex education, this is what I think about. I think about being 14 years old and like stretching before track practice, like with my friend Katie, and her and I are sitting there talking. We're like, okay, cool. Like, we get that you're not supposed to have sex, but like, what counts? Like, and we're like, so like, do hand jobs count? Do blow jobs count? I just remember us just like sitting there being like, I mean, even when I'm told not to do something, I'm not even given enough information for me to know not what I'm supposed to not do. Like, and I just remember we were sitting there and like, I'm so horrified when I look back and thinking about it, because obviously we were genuinely confused. And I'm old enough that was at a time that like, the only computer in the house was like in the living room where your whole family would be. So you are not Googling this stuff on your own time. Like, that would be very complicated conversation with your parents that you're probably avoiding having in the first place, which is why you didn't just ask them. But like, I think about all of that stuff, and I think all the time about when I was a teenager and I would watch, and I like just like innately like was so confused by the fact that like the people who were teaching my friends about sex were the people trying to have sex with my friends. And they'd say, oh, this is okay. You can touch me there. And they're like, oh, I felt weird about it, but he said it was okay. And I'm like, I feel like that's a problem. And I don't have the language to like really describe why I think that's a problem, but that feels like not the best way to get information. Because once again, like, you not giving me information means not that nobody's getting me information. It just means that now we have even less control of the type of information I'm getting.
You know, that makes me think of something that's kind of controversial to say, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it into this conversation. I think oftentimes, whenever we talk about sexual violence, we always say that the root is about power and control. But in saying that, we ignore that sex is still a part of sexual violence. And it is something that is a part of it for both the person perpetrating violence and the person who has experienced that trauma. But we don't really think about, did those individuals have the skills to even know what was happening beforehand? Were they able to actually confidently and comfortably experience this without just making assumptions and being in their own head about it? And, you know, we can't just automatically assume that everybody has the skills to have conversations about consent and boundaries and desires and expectations with any potential sexual partner if we never give young people this information. So Megan, like you were saying, we have college students who only know they were assaulted after the fact when they learn what consent is.
Absolutely. Like, the thing I go back to all the time, and I know this is going to be like digging a little bit back in the vault, but do you guys remember that whole controversy with Aziz Ansari a few years ago? And yeah, I always, when I think about it, I think about my versus my husband's reaction to that story. And like, that's even me like doing what I do for a living, which is like always the context I come from. I'm like, when I'm befuddled by stuff, I come from a place where like, I talk about these things with my coworkers all the time. Like, and I research these things, and I like, and even then, like, I hit walls all the time where I'm just like, oh yeah, that. So like, how can I really have an expectation of someone who has even less access to like coworkers and like people who are excellent in the field and stuff like that, who are able to just like educate and talk and like teach all the time. But I remember us reading that, and he was horrified. Like, he just read it and he was like, I can't believe that someone would do that. Like, that's the most horrific, like, and he was very upset about it. And I remember my first reaction being like, yeah, I've been on that date before. And like, so has every other woman I've ever met in my life. And there was just this little thing in my head that for a second was like, yeah, that happens. Like, not a big deal. And it's like, it is a big deal, but it's so common that like, especially if you're a woman, it doesn't feel like a big deal. And that's like, and that I think is the real crux of it, is like, we're talking about something that's so prevalent that we don't even know how to communicate that it matters, because we assume that ignorance should be the default. And that's the problem. Like, we assume ignorance is the default. And so they might not be able to tell whether your yes means yes or your no means no. We assume that they might be, instead of us giving education and then knowing that they have that information and they're choosing not to do it. Like, part of the reason why I think rape is such an effective tool of that power and control is because it's so universally exploitable. Like, it is something that people have such little information about, have such high like emotional reactions to, and have so much, like, depending on your background, you're taught so much of how your worth is connected to this thing. Like, this thing that you don't talk about, this thing that you can't ask questions about, this thing that you can't really explore without being a certain kind of person, this thing that inherently affects your value as a human. Like, there's no greater power than somebody being able to take that choice for you. And then you don't even have the language to be able to communicate to other people what happened, or to even understand that why you might reacting to something, because you might not understand cognitively that it's traumatic. And so your body might be reacting in that very instinctive, I'm reacting to trauma way, but like your active like brain up here has no idea that's what's happening. So then you think you're just acting irrationally. And you're like, well, this just happens. I'm crazy right now. I guess it's feelings. I guess, that time of the month is whatever you want to say it is, because you can't even marry those two things in your head where your body knows what happened is wrong, but your brain is saying, it's something that just I have to live with. This is something that is not unnormal.
I really like the way that you just phrased that, Sam. So I appreciate you bringing in that experience of how both you and your partner reacted to the Aziz story. And I think that, yeah, unfortunately, I agree with you. For a lot of women I know, they've been on that date. For a lot of queer people I know, they've been on that date, and it is seen as something that's endemic. But I really like the way that you phrased it at the end there. And I think that a big part of this conversation that is often left out is really about how someone experiences that neurobiology of trauma. And I kind of want to dig into that a little bit more, because I think that complicates the issue of drug facilitated sexual assault. I think so often in these conversations about campus sexual violence, when drug facilitated sexual assault is brought in, automatically the conversation goes to, well, what's the most common date rape drug? How do you test for the date rape drug? What are common reactions to it? And I think that also really muddies the conversation, because then it feeds back into these dominant narratives. But, what we know to be the reality is alcohol is the most commonly used drug for drug facilitated sexual assault. And if you're someone who experiences an attempted drug facilitated sexual assault, or experiences actually being assaulted, even if you are sober in that, the body has a way of disassociating, so you aren't experiencing that trauma. If you add in alcohol and other drugs, it only complicates things further. So then when you're trying to recount that trauma that happened to you, it's not going to seem like all these pieces are fitting together. And unfortunately, the way that so often translates is, well, you were too drunk, or did that really happen? Because are you just misremembering the situation? And Sam, I know that you've done a lot of research around this topic, specifically to include in our new Advocates Academy training. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about some of those common, I hate myth busting, so I won't say that, but some of the misconceptions rather, about how drug facilitated sexual assault occurs.
Oh my God, you could go on forever on this. And I think some of the things that I think are so deeply telling about how we react to drug facilitated sexual assault, as you said, alcohol is the most commonly used drug. But the reality is, when we think of drugs, we think of something very specific. We think of something that is illegal or illicit or something like that. And the fact that you can access alcohol readily and easily and commonly, like in public, and it's seen as a normal part of society to imbibe it, means that people automatically disassociate it. They're like, no, that's not a drug, that's alcohol, which puts an even bigger gap between somebody being able to communicate that this was then not my fault. And that's one of the biggest things, because if alcohol is not seen as a drug, then somebody plying you with alcohol isn't necessarily seen as them giving a predatory behavior or them exploiting the fact that you've been drinking, then somehow makes you complicit, even though it's not, especially if like, as you were in college and for about half the time you're in college, you're too young in the United States, at least, you're too young to be like legally imbibing alcohol. Does that stop a single college kid who chooses to drink alcohol from doing it? Absolutely not. But it might stop your comfort in coming forward, or your belief that if I hadn't been doing this thing that I really shouldn't be doing anyways, because I legally can't do it, then maybe this thing wouldn't have happened to me. When the reality is that has very little to do with the fact that it happened to you, because as horrible as it is, we know what the numbers look like when it comes to sexual assault. And we also know that part of the reason why alcohol is the most commonly used in drug facilitated sexual assault is because it is the most easily and readily accessible that you can convince someone else to drink. And then you can very easily use that against them. And as you were talking about, Matthew, before, when it comes to the neurobiology of trauma, we also know that like when someone's experiencing trauma, the way that your brain works is that, you know, all of your like, there's real words for this, but you guys, I'm a lawyer and an English major, so like my anatomy is very poor. But the frontal part of your brain that does all your higher level thinking, that's not what your body needs to survive in that moment. What your body needs to survive at the moment is that like dinosaur lizard brain back here. And that's the thing that's like, this is how I'm going to keep you safe. And that's where all the blood in your body is going, because it's a physical response. That's where all the blood in your body is going. That's where you're pumping everything. That's where adrenaline's coming from. And so we already know that at a very base level, even without any sort of drug involved, people struggle when it comes to putting together things that happened in something that was deeply traumatic for them, like a sexual assault or something of that, because that's not what's important to your brain at that moment. What's important to your brain at that moment is that you keep having a brain that's functioning long term and in the short term. So all your body's doing is figuring out how to survive this. It doesn't care to log that experience in any sort of like time sequential, easily verified order. It's saying, hi, I would like to be alive in 3 hours. What do I need to focus on to get you there? And then when you add alcohol to that mix, people very rarely talk about the fact that like, that's an added thing on top of the trauma. Like, and so then you're made to feel like, oh, I don't remember it. I don't remember this probably because I drank too much alcohol. So it's kind of my fault. And it's like, you don't know that. No, we don't know that. Like, it could be that you don't remember it in part because you experienced something deeply traumatic and your body was not going there because it needed to do that, you know? And no matter what it is, like, it doesn't excuse the fact that you were clearly in no position to be able to have any sort of reaction to it, which is what somebody capitalized on to begin with, which is why they chose to assault you then, because they knew that the odds were in their favor. That's what power and control is, you know? And sex is one of the easiest ways to gain power and control over someone else. I mean, when it comes to like, you know, we talk about like date rape and stuff like that, but talk about dating violence. How many people do we see that our advocates work with who don't even bring in the idea that they might have been sexually assaulted by their partner, even as they're willing to talk to advocates and authorities about other types of violence that they might have experienced? Because that is like how deeply personal and taboo talking about sex is, and talking about the lack of power that someone might have when someone assaults you. And we see it all too often that like people who are getting out, people who are doing stuff and engaging and are totally comfortable talking about the rest of the violence they might have experienced, might still never really connect or wrap their mind around the fact that they were also sexually assaulted by this person during this time, because it's that deeply taboo. And for that reason, if you can in any way, it's so taboo that I am so in charge of my sexuality as like a woman that exists in the world. If it's my job to be the gatekeeper, if it's my job to say no, if it's my job to wear high color baggy clothing and, you know, keep my keys in my fist and, you know, travel with 7 buddies, then clearly, you know, I should have we're given this almost bizarrely like superhero like sense of responsibility over our ability to not be assaulted by somebody. And so it's like, I have to make it my fault because that's the only way I can wrap my mind around what happened. Because I've been told that I can keep this from happening to me. I've been told that if I make the right choices, if I do the right things, if I don't go to the wrong parties, if I don't drink too much, if I don't wear that clothing, if I don't do this, then this isn't going to happen to me because I was promised that I could prevent this. Then that means if it happens to me, I did something wrong. Because that's the only information and messaging I've ever gotten about this. And that is just like, it's such that complex thing of issues. So then you have people who don't want to come forward, especially if I'm not old enough to drink alcohol in the first place, you know? And people will also react. They aren't going to believe you necessarily. And they're going to have that exact same reaction that you're having. I think about this in the context of like, as there's a connection. When we talk about workplace sexual harassment and the fact that the research shows that like over 90% of the time, people's reaction to workplace sexual harassment is never to come forward and talk about it. And the reason why is because of that fear of reprisal. They're like, people won't believe me. They won't come forward. This will somehow backfire and I'm going to be harmed by it. It's going to make my life more difficult. It's going to change the way people view me and my ability to do my job and function. The research also shows that those people are 100% correct. That absolutely happens. That's why you have a fear of it. This is the exact same thing. I'm afraid you won't believe me because I'm smart enough to know the odds are you won't believe me. So I'm actually making a deeply rational choice to protect myself, and perhaps the only way I know how to at this point, when I've lost so much control in other places, because why am I going to open myself up to even more trauma if there's no high likelihood that that's going to benefit me? And the reality is, unfortunately, they're right. So I'm a glass half full person this morning.
Well, I do want to shift that conversation a little bit from what you were saying, Sam, of there is this overall culture of silence with the fear of not being believed when survivors do come forward, the fear of not having a strong and supportive response from your college institution, from local law enforcement, whomever you might choose to report it to. So shifting that conversation a bit, Megan, you do a daily briefing report that you send out to all staff that really kind of looks through news coverage of intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and other topics related to our work. So really this month and over the last few weeks in general, we have seen a lot more media coverage of student activism and social change happening on campus, where students are demanding that their institutions hold people accountable when sexual assault is occurring. So I was wondering if you can kind of go into that, how you're seeing student activism and the ways that students are trying to hold their institutions accountable, really shifting in this more kind of dominant narrative of students aren't being believed, so they're taking it upon themselves to change the culture.
Yeah, I can definitely go into that a little bit more, but I had something that kind of popped into my mind as Sammy was sharing, of just how, this is a phrase you kind of said, Sammy, of just essentially prevention is put onto you, the onus of prevention is put onto you as the potential victim or survivor that's what our prevention strategies are about the individual person, to the point where you so internalize this idea that you have to be you're the guard for yourself. You're the one that protects yourself from sexual assault and no one else will. I think that kind of goes into the student activism kind of shift, is like, I'm not the only one who's responsible. And in fact, I'm not responsible for that happening to me. And just kind of how going into our other conversation, these kind of all flow together, but just how our prevention strategies have failed because they're not really about prevention. It's about avoidance of that topic, avoidance of the conversation of the realities of what it means for us to not teach children about their bodily autonomy, not teach children about themselves, about, how to accept and know how to read someone's body language, and also kind of the role that alcohol can play and people not being able to pick up on cues anymore, and just how prevalent alcohol is on campus, people totally losing their ability because of inebriation to understand what's happening in a situation that can lead to sexual assaults that fall into what a lot of people feel like is a gray area for them. They might have experienced the assault and they might not describe it as an assault because of alcohol. Well, I was drinking and they were drinking, and it's kind of all happened, and just how alcohol can play into that. And so I think for a lot of students, they're at this point, they're kind of standing up and saying, we're tired of having to fight for this basic respect on campus, having to advocate for ourselves so hard, knowing that probably nothing will happen. And so some of the really high profile cases have come out of Kansas and Nebraska at some universities, and many of them kind of centered around fraternities. So, and like kind of that red zone that Matthew was talking about at the top of the episode, of just these fraternities are places where a lot of times at the beginning of college, that's what students do the first week is party. If you're a freshman, you don't know where to go. You might have a fake ID, you might not. And the place you're probably going to be going is fraternity because they have a lot of access to alcohol. And this is we'll go into the book a little bit, but also because for a lot of young women, they're looking to explore their sexuality. They have an opportunity to do that because they're not under the roof of their parents. And that goes for all students, but these cases were specific to young girls. I think, and both of the two biggest cases were freshmen. And a girl was 17. And the students, this happened in the fraternities, and then the responses on campus did not match what students wanted. And so they were looking to get the student who assaulted the other student off campus. They were looking for the fraternities to be shut down. And in many cases that didn't happen. And so these protests kind of ballooned because they were like, you're not listening to us. And we are tired of having people's experience on campus be assault. And there was, an article in the Kansas City Star about this, about another case that happened in Kansas. And it kind of talked about some of the rates in Missouri universities. And I was really struck by like my alma mater, and also I think everyone was close alma mater in some aspects, was that 1 in 4 female identified students experienced sexual assault while they were on campus as an undergrad. I believe it's underground statistics. And just the fact that that is a reality for so many students in our region, that they would have to go and face the fact that they might experience assault and know the university is not protecting them, is not shutting down the places that are known places. Like, I don't know if you, Sam, you might not, or Matthew, when I was on campus, my first week, freshman year, I was a little 18, baby Megan, I was told by multiple students, do not go to these fraternities. These are the rape fraternities. For us freshmen to know, they just got on campus, that legacy of those fraternities, and for them to still exist on campus just points to what these students were so tired of. Like, how am I going to know this coming onto this campus? And the admin is not going to do anything about this. And so students are tired of that, and they're really standing up. And I think it's kind of a byproduct of the Me Too movement. People are stepping out, standing up, saying, I'm done with this and I'm not going to be silent. And I think it takes so much bravery to be willing to have your story out there like that. And I think that these young students are really going to be the ones that are pushing change, because in all realities, what pushes social change is social unrest, is people saying, I'm not doing this anymore and I'm going to disrupt the university space. We're going to make this really uncomfortable for you until you look us in the face and actually do something about this.
The thing that I think is really interesting when it comes to so much of how we talk about sexual assault prevention strategies that have been put in place over the years and stuff like that, is how much of it is that like sexual assault like just happens. Like, that's what it's like. It's like you prepare for a sexual assault, like you prepare for a possible tornado. Like, this is something completely outside of our control that we can in no way do anything to stop. It just happens, and this is how you like minimize the damage. And that's what it is. It's not violence prevention. It's we're teaching women how to minimize the potential damage. And not just women, you know, especially like as you brought up earlier, Matthew, like people in the LGBTQ community, people who are like the amount of times that like it's just this very we're taught that if I do these things, I'm going to minimize the damage of if this happens, when this happens to me. And it's also that I remember the amount of times in my life where I've been somewhere and I'm like, oh, this is when it happens. Like, not if, like, it is so deeply like ingrained on the things I have, my like fun little checklist I take everywhere, that these are the things I have to do to not be sexually assaulted today. And that's what it is. It's not to be indeterminately never sexually assaulted. It's like, if I leave my house today and I do these 30 things, then I probably won't be assaulted on my way into work today. Like, and you do it. And there's stuff that's so fascinatingly deeply ingrained that you don't even realize you do it. And that's where it's like really insidious. It's like the amount of things I do that in my head I do because it's like, I mean, it's basically like you don't step on a crack, you know, and then like something bad won't happen to you, or you don't leave a penny. Like that's exactly about on par with the amount of things I do to prevent being sexually assaulted. But it's so deeply ingrained in me that like I don't stop doing it. And the amount of times where like after like my husband and I moved in together, neither of us have having lived with someone of the opposite gender before, where he was just so confused by stuff I didn't even think about doing. Like at all. Like one of the things that like I wish were like in much wider use when I was living alone, which I was for many years, was smart light bulbs. As weird, like those things are like the most genius things. I was like the amount, like the fact that I can come home and turn on a light in my kitchen before I walk in the front door makes me feel safer. And I remember like when my husband showed me his house for the first time, like when we were dating, and I was like, this was not designed by a woman. And he's like, what do you mean? And I said, dude, the light to turn on, the light switch to turn on the lights in this front room, I have to walk across the room to get there. There's not a single woman in the planet that would design this room and not have the light switch be the easiest thing to reach in this room when I open this door. Like, and he was just like, oh, I never thought about that. And I was like, I don't ever not think about that. Like, I don't ever not think about, like when I was in college and graduate school and I lived alone, I would have male friends come over. Even when I wasn't dating somebody, I would make sure that I would have male friends come over on occasion so that people didn't know that I, as a woman, was primarily there by myself, because I didn't want, I don't talk to my neighbors, like to the point that I've been out of college for many years now. And like, I still, it's deeply ingrained in me to like share as little about my life as possible with my neighbors. My husband, he goes and he's super friendly and like everybody, and he is the nicest person, but everybody's like, Tom's so lovely. And like our neighbors also this, and they're like, Mr. Tom, Miss Sarah. And I'm like, yep, that's the level I want to have with strangers. You don't even know my right name and I'm not mad about it, because like all I wanted was to not be noticed. I didn't want people to know when I was in my house by myself. I didn't want people to know when I came home late or what my schedule was or like all of these things. And like, that's so normal that we forget that it shouldn't be normal. And those are all things that I started doing when I first moved out. And so by the time in which like, you know, I'm at the age of 31 moving in with my husband, I didn't even think about the fact. So it's also that the things that we're putting in place in college become deeply ingrained social behaviors that they're taking forward for the rest of their lives, because it's made during this formative year. It's made as like that imaginary wish list. If I do these things, then I will be safe, because that's all I can do to keep myself safe, because I'm not the problem and I'm not the reason I'm not safe. And we don't talk about that whole rest of the equation.
Well, I am going to shift our conversation today to really focus on that part of the equation. So kind of wrapping up our conversation today, I wanted us to explore the topics in 3 different books that really kind of dig into that very thing. And the first one is a book called Fraternity Gang Rape. The second edition was released in 2007. And it really kind of documents the change in attitude and culture on college campuses from the 1960s up through the early 2000s. Something that the author talks about is the kind of the first sexual revolution of the 1960s that came out of feminism was largely, the impetus for it was largely because women began openly talking about their experience of sexual assault and sexual violence. And so then flipping that narrative was women trying to say, we want to be in control of our own sexuality and our own bodies. And then the way that that evolved was women gaining access, or some women being able to more easily access birth control, but even having that sort of autonomy over their sex life was still largely on men's terms. And so really when she began looking at college campuses and how women were experiencing sexual assault, a pattern that came up, and Megan, it goes back to something that you were talking about, is on many college campuses, there were fraternities that were hotspots of sexual violence. And there was a combination of things happening there where, like we've talked about, students were coming to campus with little to no education on sex, sexuality, consent, and how to talk about that. Then there were these hotspots on campus where toxic masculinity was something that was going unchecked, and then was also being taught to young men coming in their freshman year from older fraternity members. And so then that really toxic and abusive behavior is being taught and reinforced. And then when you look at the college campus itself, there was no institutional response. So tying that into something that you just said, Sam, the things that were being taught to young women and young men in their early stages of their college life then just kept being reinforced later on. And it was really interesting how this author documented, like I said, from the 1960s up to the early 2000s. And in that span of time, the dynamics didn't really change on college campuses. They still largely remained the same. So then I thought that was really interesting in going back and reviewing that book, Fraternity Gang Rape, whenever we have some newer books with newer research that's come out that really kind of does these case studies on students' experiences on campus now. And I think that those conversations have really changed in the last 15 to 20 years. So the other book that I wanted us to kind of talk about is a book by Lisa Wade called American Hookup. She's a sociologist that went around the country and really started doing case studies with college students to hear from them what hookup culture is like on campus. And it was a very different account than what the previous author of Fraternity Gang Rape had experienced. And so what Lisa Wade found was there were many more students who were talking about competition for status. And so hookups were very much tied to status, and you having a certain number of hookups increased your status on campus. And then also really thinking about how students were ambivalent to what they were experiencing. And so a particular story that always sticks with me from the book American Hookup is a student who described her experience at a house party where the party was getting near the end. She was really intoxicated. She knew the people who lived in the house where they were, and it was a long way for her to get home. So she basically did a safety plan for herself of, I'd rather take the risk of passing out here and knowing the people who might assault me than trying to make it home on my own and not knowing what could happen to me there. And so I think it's really interesting just to look at, over the last 40 years, student experiences have changed a lot. But Megan, I wrote down a quote that you said earlier: you're not listening to us and we're tired of it. that's where I really see the conversation changing now.
That's such an excellent point, because I feel like a lot of what researchers have done in the past is kind of not listening as directly to what students are talking about in terms of their experiences, or even just like kind of the conversation. I can't even just say researchers, but so much for survivors and people who've experienced, who might not identify as a survivor, but experience that we would encounter sexual assault, are like, listen to what I'm saying and stop telling me about my experience. And I think like that's something that as advocates, as people who work with survivors, is really, really important for us to have at the forefront of our minds when we're talking about things like sexual assault on college campuses and also in our work as a whole. But like, we need to stop telling students their experiences and start listening to what their experiences are. And then our strategies, our responses need to be informed directly by students and directly by survivors and people who are sharing their experiences. And that's kind of a lot of what the book Sexual Citizens, the third book, was about. I have so many notes, so I'm really going to try to like talk less. I highly recommend that anybody who has the opportunity to read this book, because it was phenomenal. And even though it's a research book, it was written in a really engaging way, which is not always the case with research heavy books. So I also got to see a Prevent Connect webinar with the authors yesterday. So very incredible timing. But it was really cool because there was close to 300 people who were in attendance. And there's people from all over the world. Someone's like, I'm from Germany, I'm from Spain. Like, people were in the middle of the night joining this webinar because of how much this topic and what was in this book resonated with them. So this book is kind of a culmination of a huge research project by Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan, and it was really centered around case studies of students on the Columbia University campus, and also kind of observing their environment. So they had young researchers who were also students who, with permission, of course, would be in a lot of these kind of environments. They would go to parties, they would go to bars and talk to students in these environments in which a lot of what we're seeing related to sexual assault, some of the environments that it's facilitated in or is occurring in. And so the book kind of came about because a lot of the authors wanted to understand sex on campus. So they really started with this framework of not just about sexual assault, but like sex on campus. And that kind of is one of the things we've talked about this whole episode, is just how important that conversation around sex is. And when we take that out of the equation, how much we miss. And so there was like kind of this other element too of them thinking about, when we think about sexual assault, the narrative we've had is the kind of hunting ground narrative. So that was a documentary that came out, I believe, in 2014. And it was very much focused around this idea of more stranger kind of facilitate, like stranger sexual assault, very like sociopathic predators kind of framing, which is definitely a very relevant framework, and it does occur with a lot of sexual assaults, but it totally takes out the piece of the fact that there are a lot of sexual assaults that are not from sociopathic predators, from people who just don't know what they're doing because they have total lack of understanding of how to read body language, and they realize that wasn't okay. There was a couple moments in the book where like this young man is realizing that he assaulted somebody. And he was like, oh my God, I had no idea. Like, I just realizing that I did not get consent for this. And then having this moment of like, that person isn't a sociopathic predator. They were devastated by realizing they'd hurt somebody like that. And the kind of that hunting ground narrative takes away from the ability to help those people and prevent assaults from those individuals from happening. And so really the book was about shifting from the get rid of bad people narrative to prevent sexual assault from happening, because that doesn't really take care of the issue. It's very reactive versus preventative oriented, where we should be coming from a place of how do we stop this from happening in the first place, not just let's get rid of every single person who was a sexual predator who committed some kind of sexual assault. And I think we've kind of seen this throughout, like, the great American experiment, that just locking people up has never solved any of our problems. We don't see this immense reduction in sexual assault when we lock away with rapists. And part of that has to do with the fact that a lot of people don't come forward. They don't report. So how are we supposed to catch all the bad people if people aren't even coming forward about their experiences because for whatever reason it could potentially be. And so we have to look at sexual assault differently if we want to do that. So that's kind of the background of the book. So, and then throughout it, it had kind of three main themes. And the first was sexual projects. Second was sexual citizenship. And the third was sexual geographies. So the sexual projects piece was like, what is sex for? So what are individuals' views and thoughts on sex, the kind of sex they want to have, the sexual experiences they desire. And a lot of times people's sexual projects can be a mismatch. And that's where we see some of the sexual assaults that people might define for themselves as a gray area. Even if we know from like a legal definition that sexual assault, that oftentimes has been framed as bad sex. That's kind of goes to the Aziz Ansari thing. A lot of people read that article and their view was, oh, that's just bad sex, you know, because they don't have the language for that. And so someone's sexual projects can be a mismatch for each other, or their understanding of how to, you know, honor someone's sexual citizenship, which is the next piece, which is that we all have the right to sexual self-determination. And what are your rights and obligations to yourself and to others? And how do you respect someone else's sexual citizenship, but also respect your own? And this was part of this was really specifically focusing around women and LGBTQ folks whose sexual rights and needs are often completely ignored. You know, a lot of times throughout the book, people who were in one of those two, you know, demographic kind of groups were talking about how they had this huge sense of I'm obligated for a male's pleasure. Like I am obligated to make sure that the man I'm having sex with experiences pleasure, even if I am not wanting to do this. So a lot of people were feeling like they couldn't refuse because they felt bad. Or I can't say no because we went on this date together and I said yes to these things. And so I feel like I owe him this. And it was really focused around those kind of gender dynamics. But again, that could be true for anyone, is you feel that you owe somebody something. And that a lot of times, like a perpetuator sexual citizenship is about what they want related to sex and like, you know, their own sexual citizenship, but they're not considering someone else's sexual citizenship and how that's a really important piece. And the third one, which was sexual geographies, is like, what are the features of the space and who controls the space? And so this is where they really started delving into how important it is when we have these conversations around campus sexual assault to talk about all the different intersecting identities of how white campuses typically are, especially if we're talking about some of like, you know, Columbia, for example, is a really, really white campus. And that's a really critical factor for understanding the impact of different students' experiences. You know, intersecting forms of power and inequality, like it's not just about gender, like gender is very important, but sexual assault is not just about gender-based violence. You know, if you are a lower income student on campus, you don't have the same options as a student with higher incomes. They talked about like, you could be in a situation where like, I kind of want to go home. I'm not feeling this is not a good vibe. If you were a low income student, you probably can't afford an expensive Uber. So how are we going to get home? Or they were in New York. So it's like, okay, well now I have to take a subway, which potentially could put me into danger. You know, taking the subway late at night is not always the safest thing. And so again, it goes back into putting that onus onto a student to protect themselves and prevent assault from happening to them. And how if we don't take into account, you know, different elements of people's race, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their like socioeconomic status, we're going to be missing the important pieces of how do we understand the spaces in which sexual assaults are occurring. And so that's part of the like piece about fraternities. Fraternities on campuses are allowed to have alcohol. These are male controlled spaces, but sororities, which are female controlled spaces, are not allowed to have alcohol. So you're automatically setting up a campus structure where like men on campus can have a lot of power because of alcohol. And like fixing that problem is not about saying no alcohol on campuses, because students are going to be drinking. So how do we make sure that people can be safe and have an ability to have control over their own space? And that includes other groups too. Like there was some groups in the book talking about, you know, it was like one was a Latinx student group and how they were like, we get to have our we get to have our parties. We get to be in spaces where we get to control the space. But because we don't always have a house or a space to do that in, we're not always given the opportunity to have our own, you know, culturally controlled spaces where we get to decide, you know, the situation we're drinking in, the people who are there and like feel safe, and how important it is for us to understand the geography of a campus, geography of a situation in which these sexual assaults are occurring. And that all those pieces are really, really important for us in terms of understanding sexual assault on campus and actually working to address that.
So fascinating book. Sounds like a really fascinating webinar that Prevent Connect did. So for our listeners, go check out the webinar from our friends at Prevent Connect to be able to listen more from the author's perspective. I'll also go ahead and give a plug to the other two books if folks are interested in learning more there. So American Hookup and Fraternity Gang Rape. And, you know, I kind of want to just wrap this up by saying, Megan and Sam, I really appreciate you both being on this episode with me to dig into a topic that, as we've said several times, is still really taboo. And luckily, we are seeing examples of how it is changing and becoming more common that we do openly have this conversation. But we also still have a long way to go. So I think lifting up and listening to students and their experiences, just like you said, Megan, that's one of the best things we can do for prevention. Listen to what students are saying and then provide them the space that they are asking for and demanding, because it shouldn't be on students to prevent their own assaults. All right, well, again, thank you both for being on today. Really great episode. And as always, I love having other members of the prevention team on. So thanks, Megan. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew.